I'm Joyce Harper, Professor of Reproductive Science at the Institute for Women's Health at University College London. Welcome to Season 3 of my podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? This season, we'll be diving into topics that explore how to achieve good health and happiness. I'll be speaking with leading experts who will provide evidence-based advice and debunk some of the many myths around our health. Additionally, I'll be having conversations with individuals who bring unique perspectives through their lived experiences. In Season 3, we'll cover a diverse range of topics, including reproductive anatomy, inspiring female icons, chronic health conditions, factors that influence our well-being, and global women's health issues. I really hope you enjoy Season 3 of Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? Welcome to the next episode of the podcast in the series about reclaiming joy. And today we're talking to my drumming teacher, Dr. Sophie Messager. The beat of your own drum, drumming for women's health. Sophie did a PhD in biology on the physiology of reproduction in France. Then in the 90s, she moved to the UK, fell in love, started a family, and discovered her true calling through birth experiences by becoming a doula. Trading science for birth work in 2010, she became a perinatal educator and doula and published her first book, Why Postnatal Recovery Matters. Witnessing the power of birth opened her mind to spiritual dimensions, leading her to become a Reiki and Reiki drum practitioner and teacher and drum circle facilitator. Today, Sophie supports women through their life's transitions. She offers closing the bone ceremonies and various other healing rituals, reclaiming lost traditions and blending science with spiritual practices. When not facilitating ceremonies or training professionals, she will be wild swimming, drumming in nature, or dancing the 5 rhythms, staying connected to her body, spirit, and the natural world. Her new book, titled The Beat of Your Own Drum, is a tool to empower women and is being published in September 2025, but you can pre-order it now. The Beat of Your Own Drum explores the history, science, and contemporary use of drumming, particularly as a path for women's wisdom, health, and transformation. And Sophie has a podcast called The Wisdom Messenger. Welcome, Sophie.
Hey, thank you, Joyce. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's a real pleasure to talk to you. And we've talked a lot over the years we've known each other, so I know we're going to have a really fun conversation today. But I wanted to start, before we get on to the drumming, which is what we're really passionate about. Sophie, you've had a really eventful and varied career, and you actually started your career after, doing a PhD and working in the physiology of reproduction. So tell us about that.
So the really interesting thing about that, Joyce, is that it wasn't really the physiology of reproduction that got me into there. What got me into there is I was really interested in chronobiology. And I ended up basically sidetracked into how melatonin affects, how daylight and melatonin affect reproduction, which is why I ended up doing my PhD in that field. But what I was really interested in, it started when I was a first-year university student, is I went to a lecture about chronobiology, and the guy explained that people always ask why and how and what, but they don't ask when. And the story he told about, how we often live at odds with our natural energy. That is, people used to rest in the winter when they farmed the land and basically work hard in the summer. And when school became obligatory, then we had to start having, the farmers said, you can have our kids, but we need them back for the harvest. And that's how we ended up having holidays at the time where technically we're not supposed to need as much rest as we do when the nights are longer, in the winter. And I wanted to understand more about that. That's what got me into that field. And then it ended up that basically it was on the sort of understanding how it in fact impacted, the the fact that different species breed at different time of the year based on how long their pregnancy is, and I just kind of fell into the whole reproductive thing, and then it's just really interesting because as a theme, then the whole reproductive things keep being there over and over and over again in my work, and kind of still is even in the part of the drumming.
Yeah, for sure. And after you'd been doing your hardcore science work, shall we say, you then went on to become a doula and a National Childbirth Trust educator, a baby weaning instructor, a Reiki
Baby
practitioner,
wearing, baby wearing,
baby wearing,
carrying
baby,
babies. Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
baby. So tell us all about that. Tell us about what baby wearing is. Tell us about being a doula and the educator and the Reiki. Tell us about all of that.
So what happened is I had a complete change of heart after I had my first child, because I went from a place of, like many women, really, really scared of childbirth, thought it was horrible, you should have all the drugs, it's like going to the dentist, and no concept whatsoever of how empowering birth could be. And then I hired a doula because I was scared. And then I had such a mind-blowing first birth, the opposite of what I thought it would be, really empowering. Then I thought, almost instantly, I want to help other women do that. And then along the way, I picked up a lot of other things. You know, the baby wearing was because my first child, was a Velcro baby, and then I ended up learning to help other parents carry their babies. I did side by side the doula training and the antenatal education training. I actually went and got myself a diploma of higher education in antenatal education from from a university in the UK, because I don't do things by half. And it just became my new passion. You know, I spent 20 years in research, both in academic and industrial setting, in biotech and big pharma setting. But then the same kind of, and that's going to come later. I didn't know I was neurodivergent, but the same when I do get my teeth into something, I don't do one book or one training. I just go all in, and it became really like the doula support became like the cornerstone of everything. And being at birth was what ignited the desire to pursue Reiki training further. So I'd already done Reiki training 10 years before I became a doula, but I'd not really done anything with it. And you can't be in the room at the moment a baby is being born and not feel the phenomenal energy in the room. You cannot not feel that. So I felt so interested by that. I thought, okay, I want to understand more. And that's why I ended up training to be a Reiki 2 and then Reiki master, and then trained to become, I ended up teaching Reiki to birth professionals from the angle of how it can be useful for birth. And then eventually trained to do Reiki drum, which is where you channel Reiki through a drum, and then trained to do Reiki drum teaching, although I've not actually taught it as such, because I've moved more and more into helping people do it intuitively rather than as part of something that requires very structured processes.
And
Yeah, so that's it. Yeah.
no, carry on.
Well, it's like there's a really interesting thing for me, which is now really part of what I do. In like is part of everything that I offer, which is bridging the scientific and the esoteric, bridging the science and the woo, which has become a signature thing, because since I straddle both worlds, I can understand. You know, once upon a time, I thought this was all bullshit. I remember going to retreats where people use crystals, and I was like, what's that bullshit? And I felt the same about a lot of things I practice now. So I can understand how to help people undo their skepticism, and almost not just skepticism. People are like often very wary of doing non-scientific, what's perceived as non-scientific, except it's often just a perception, not a fact.
Yeah, we have to remember we are both PhDs, we are both evidence based scientists, and I have some of my friends as well think I've gone a bit woo woo. And you and I have talked about that. That's a word that you've used a lot, and I use a lot as well. And they do consider that, you know, things like Reiki and the drumming, and we're going to talk about other things as a bit woo woo. But both of us have felt the power of what's being done here and what we're going to talk about, and other things that we you and I dabble in, or you dabble in much more than me, but I dabble in. But
Mm.
these sort of the holistic therapies. But I am open to it, and I've seen at some of your events how powerful doing these techniques can be. So I think anyone listening and thinking Joyce is going crazy with all this woo woo stuff, stay listening, because remember, we're both PhDs, and we grew up on the textbook science based stuff, but we've really opened up to this. And yes, we need more evidence, of course, when we'll talk about that later. But it's powerful, isn't it? It's powerful stuff that we're going to talk
It
about
is. It is.
now. Pregnancy and birth. I know this is obviously birth. Like, my work, so many people around me. I work with a lot of obstetricians. We're talking about birth literally almost every day, and you're very supportive of that. Now, correct me if I've pronounced this wrong. Is it rebozo? Is that right? Rebozo.
Yeah. Rebozo, yeah.
Rebozo birthing technique, and I know you've been looking a lot at the evidence about this, and also the closing the bones ritual. So can you tell us
Yeah.
more about that?
So rebozo techniques, a rebozo is basically a Mexican scarf. It's hand-woven Mexican scarf, a shawl of sorts. I learned that because as a first year doula, I was utterly frustrated with what I call the sort of typical a posterior baby car crash, which is a woman who would have a baby would have turned back to back. So typically, you want the baby what's considered the optimal position is a baby position, so that the back of the baby's head is facing the mother's tummy. And a back to back baby, the baby is actually facing the mother's back. The back of the baby's head is facing the mother's back, and that usually makes a labor more challenging because simply of the anatomical shape of the lumbar spine, making less room for the baby's head to fit into the pelvis when the baby's facing that way. And what was really frustrating for me as a doula was that every time I would see a mother what would unfold is the mother would have a delay around 6 centimeters, would not dilate, and then she would get this early urge to start pushing. And people would poke their fingers around, said, "You're not fully dilated, you should stop pushing." And then do the exact opposite of what's needed, which is get the woman on her back in the bed with an epidural. And then that would almost always unfold into theatre, either in cesarean or forceps birth. And the ridiculousness of the process of the biomechanical, you have a baby who's in less than optimal position. What you need is to encourage a woman to follow her body, because I've read a lot of research that shows that actually this early urge to push is not an issue at all. The issue is the way the system handles it. But I was so annoyed about seeing this thing that, when I'd meet women who say that their first labor I did up in cesarean, I could almost tell before they told the story that they were going to tell me this happened and then that and that and that, and I was like, yeah. So I learned those things that are Mexican midwifery traditional techniques that involve using the scarf to either rock or wrap the body, but often is some form of gentle wobbling and jiggling of the mother's pelvis or belly. Because those things, they were created when there was no way to get a baby out other than vaginally, and those midwives had all this wisdom, and none of it is actually woo. It's just biomechanics, right? If something's stuck, you jiggle it. If you're tense, you jiggle the mother. It's like, so I started learning these things, and in my usual obsessive way, I trained with like 7 or 8 different people and just kept learning. And within the first year of me learning, I saw miracles. That is, where before the labor would have gone on and on with a mother who's getting despondent and the baby not coming. And usually back-to-back labor are often more painful, because, again, when there's not when the process is not being productive, it usually hurts more. Do you see what I mean? And often back-to-back labors create back pain that doesn't stop between contraction, or pain in the sacrum that doesn't stop between contraction. It's really difficult to manage for the mother. So I started using those techniques, which usually there's lots and lots of techniques I've learned, but the 3 techniques I'd often use the most would be jiggling the buttocks with the scarves whilst the mother was on her hands and knees, or gently rocking the belly whilst the mother was on her hands and knees. And sometimes rocking the hips, whilst the mother was either lying or standing. But I went to labors that where I could see the pattern unfolding like that, and the mother was being offered the epidurals or offered diamorphine or pethidine as a form of pain relief to stop her from pushing. And I remember this labor where the women said, I don't want the epidural, I don't want to leave the birth center, but I'll have the diamorphine, because by then she'd been in labor for over 24 hours, was really tired and exhausted and had enough. And I said, okay, so if you have that drug, you're probably just going to conk out in the bed. So how about we do a bit of jiggling, and that practice those techniques in the pregnancy. So women knew, I would say, do like to do a bit of riposo. And I do, the first time I remember I did that, literally 3 contraction worth of jiggling the buttocks and 3 contraction worth of gently jiggling the belly. And then I knew something had shifted, because you can feel it in the room, but also the contraction change in their power and what they feel like to the mother. And luckily, the midwife said, I have to examine you again before I give you the drug. And she'd gone from 6 centimeters to fully dilated in 20
Wow.
minutes. So she never actually had the drug, started pushing the baby very quickly after that. Waters broke all over my shoe because it was quite a. And that scenario I've had over and over and over and over and over again with those techniques. And so what really delights me now is because there was no published research at all. In fact, there was a couple of papers in those late, 2014, 2017, that were just looking at the theory and talking about the experience of women using it, but no actual quantitative data. And the last 3 years, there's been 11 papers published, and they all show, some of them are very small, but some of them have 2,500 women.
Wow.
Some of them are proper double-blind clinical trials, where they've done something else. Well, not completely double-blind, because you can't blind that you're rocking somebody with a scarf, but they've done proper trial with different control groups and stuff, and they all show the same thing that I've always observed, is it helps with the pain. Because when you have tense muscles, the pain in labor is always typically caused by the woman going, oh my God, here comes the contraction again, goes like this, and then it hurts a lot more. So when you jiggle somebody, they can't tense up. And then the second thing that's being shown, which is also what I've observed, is it reduces the length of labor.
Wow.
And then the third thing that's also being shown is it improves the positioning of the baby. And again, it's just not rocket science, it's biomechanics. When I trained with a Mexican midwife about 3 years ago, she was showing me this technique where if the baby is not quite in the right position, she calls it flipping the pancake. You get the woman to either stand up against a wall or lie on her back, and you rock her hips, and then every once in a while you give a little jiggle, a sharp jiggle where you want the baby's towards the direction you want the baby to rotate. And often you do that once or twice, and that's it. The baby's in the optimal position. And I've had midwife palpate and confirm to me, yeah, the baby's moved. And it's complete. The other beautiful thing about those techniques is it's completely safe. And the other thing you were asking me about is closing the bones. So closing the bones is something I learned about 12 years ago. That is basically originally a postpartum healing ritual that involves also jiggling with a scarf, rebozo scarf, or other scarf, depending on the culture, and involve a massage of the abdomen, and then a process of a ritual tying of scarves around the body to kind of bring the mother back to herself. And I was delighted to find out it exists in every continent in the world. And a couple of years ago, I found a French doula who's done the same obsessive research, historical research, and that I've done for my first book, and went and found European equivalent to that tradition, which makes sense because the needs of new mothers are the same across the world. But I also found, which is something I've put in my book, a French midwife who did a thesis on that process of binding the pelvis after birth in hospital with MRI scans, and basically showed the decrease of pain and showed the movement of the pelvis. And I always come back to the same thing, Joyce, and I hope you don't mind me dropping a few F-bombs in there.
Nope.
So with the changes that the women's body undergoes during pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum, especially when you think about how during the pregnancy the pelvis change shape, the ribs change shape, the spine change shape, the entire body change shape, and then has to open to let the baby out, and then do it all in reverse to like bring the body back while starting the beginning of lactation. It's absolutely nuts that there is no standard physical process to help check that all the organs have gone back to where they belong and avoid problem before they create more long-term problem in the future. And if men gave birth, it would be a fucking Cambridge professor of the postpartum. So for me, closing the body is just bringing back. Like in my book, I have an entire chapter about body work in the postpartum, and I said body work in the postpartum is the norm for humanity, and having lost it is not normal. Because when in the UK you have a baby at 6 weeks, you go to see the GP, it's a 10-minute appointment, and mostly it's a chat to ask you if you've got sorted a contraception. There's no physical, there's no checking out the whole body is. There's none of that. It's just not there. So I've seen women who have double incontinence at 3 months postpartum who've been told it's normal. And when I trained with Gail Tully, which is a famous American midwife who created this technique called spinning babies, which I combined with Rebozo to help unlock labor, it was a chiropractor and her teaching together. And they said that on average, it takes 8 to 10 years after birth for women to seek help with long-term problems like incontinence and diastasis recti and all the kind of stuff that could be healed really quickly if they were taken care of during the very plastic time that happens in the first 6 weeks postpartum. And in there's also all the sexism and the fact that, women's health is like the Cinderella of the medical world.
You're right. And we're going to delve into women's health even a bit more later, but I really wanted to hear your experience and your vast experience to date and about how you've looked at what different cultures do, even here just around pregnancy and birth, because these are lost traditions in some countries, such as the UK. And this podcast series is about reclaiming joy. And I've called it Reclaiming Joy because I think we lose joy as well. And we're now going to talk about the drumming because I wanted to set this scene so people know that drumming is a tradition as well that's been used for our health in many different cultures. But let's first start with how you started. So I believe that you went to a retreat in 2013 that really was the thing that sparked your interest in drumming. Tell us about that.
Yeah, because around that time, it wasn't at that retreat. I had a friend who said, I do drum healing. I remember thinking, well, what's that bullshit? So I went to this retreat mostly to hang out with other doulas and, to go. It was in a beautiful place in North Wales in the middle of the forest, and an absolutely beautiful natural retreat called Caimabon. And there was a workshop there that was called Shamanic Work for Doulas. And I was very, very skeptical. But, I've been in lots of situations where I thought, let's give it a go. But I was like, it's not going to work. And she did this drum journey, and I had such unbelievably vivid image, but also a sense of, as we did a whole day of drumming, one of the beautiful things she also did, as well as drum journeys, was in turn, each woman would sit in the middle of the room and the rest of the women would drum and sing and shake rattles and intuitively sing her name based on what they felt her energy was. And the whole thing felt so like it brought back a feeling of knowing that we were meant to have those things. And I went home on holiday to France and I told my mom I want to drum. And as it happened, my mum had been on a trip in Ireland a few years before and had bought a Bowran. She gifted me this drum. And then I came back to Cambridge with this drum, and I was having this. My brother is a professional musician, so it showed me how to play it. Traditionally the Bowran is played with a little wooden stick, unpadded wooden stick called a tipper, and you're meant to be doing really fancy, fast wrist movement, but hitting the wooden stick with both sides on the drum, and I couldn't do that. And so I went home to Cambridge with my drum, and I felt all this imposter syndrome, like I can't play this drum properly. This is really instrumental because I'm going to share how I help women overcome that now. So I went to see my friend Peter Voschel, who is both a scientist and a shaman. And I said to Peter, I cannot play this drum. And then Peter just asked me one question, and he said, well, what is it you want to do with this drum, Sophie? Do you want to play in an Irish band? And I said, no, I want to do some shamanic drumming. And he said, then you do not need to learn to use it the traditional way. And he showed me there and then how to make a drum beater with a stick and some felt. And the rest is history. And I'm so grateful for that experience, because I would not be able to understand how so many of the women are stuck with not daring to play. And it's true for the drumming, and it's true for the singing, and it's true for the dancing, all the stuff that gives us joy. Because we think there's only one right way, the good enough way, that it's ridiculous when you think about it. It's a bit like if you said you can only cook if you're a Michelin star chef. What you're doing in your kitchen, you're not good enough, it's not allowed, right? There's room for all of it. It's wonderful that we have people who are masters of their crafts, and then people can do it just for joy. It's like, so now it fascinates me because of that experience. I often ask, surprisingly, a lot of the women I work with already have a drum. I also work with women who don't, but when I started, I thought I'd work mostly with women who did not have a drum, and what I found is a lot of them actually already have a drum, but they're not using it because they think they don't know how. So my prescription is super simple. I say, just pick up this drum and just play intuitively. You do not need to follow any rules. In fact, I would go as far as saying it's better to start that way, so you can feel your way into it and have fun and play and experiment. In my book, there's a quote from uh, um, a woman drummer where she says that, of course, you know how to drum. The first sound you heard was your mother's heartbeat. You know how to drum. We're all rhythmical. It's instinctive. When you look at little children, they know how to bang a drum, they know how to dance, they know how to sing. And then society puts all these layers of contraction. When you're saying we lose our joy, society put all these layers of should and self-consciousness and not worthiness and all of that upon us, and then reclaiming that is really important. So I would say it's better to practice intuitively, and then also go to a group where it's set up that way. Go to a drum circle where it's set up that people can self-express through the drum, as opposed to a drum circle where everybody's expected to play the same rhythm. And then if you want to learn to do rhythms or different types of drumming, great. But I would say my journey was I spent at least 3 or 4 years playing intuitively and faffing around and finding my way. And then when I went and did Reiki drum, which was in 2017, I think, I was certainly fascinated when the teacher said, well, the type of rhythm you're looking at to induce shamanic trance is 3 to 4 beats per second, which is 180 to 220 beats per minute. And I went home and I used the metronome and recorded, played intuitively how I'd been playing, and I'd always been playing like that.
Wow.
Nobody taught me, right?
It's amazing, and I'm very much into music and rhythm and sound. So the podcast we've just done before this one comes out is Why We Sing. And then in a few podcasts time, we've got one with Yoga Junkie talking about sound baths, which I'm big fan of. And I think that for me, I did used to play the piano, but I've always, music's always been really important to me. But with the drumming, it's just so natural, as you said, and I think probably every country of the world, maybe traditionally, has done some sort of drumming. I bought a tabla about 30 years ago, and it sits in the corner, and I've now started beating it again, and it's I just love that sound. So, but the shamanic drum is a specific type of hand drum. So, which which countries have used that traditionally? You mentioned there is the variation in Ireland,
Yeah.
but beating it with the beater, how we do when we do our shamanic drumming. Which countries use that? Have used that traditionally?
Well, I don't know all the country, but I found it to be pretty much across the board. You said, I mean, I found evidence of it in Europe. I found evidence of it in Mongolia. I found evidence of it in North America, South America. So I think there's there's I like, for me a drum is a drum. So percussion also is percussion. So it's the same. You can achieve the same state of altered consciousness with a rattle shaking, or even like beating on a book or your lap, or this percussion is percussion. But the advantage where I see the shamanic drum as more easier to approach for newbies is because when you pick up a drum and a beater, you get a good sound straight away. You don't need a skill. Like if you hit a drum with a hand, there's ways to slap the fabric that require training and learning, which is fun too. I'm doing that as well. But the shamanic drum is instantly satisfying. It's like when you play the piano, it's not different to playing the violin. When you play the piano, even though you don't really know what you're doing, you can make good sound straight away. But the shamanic drum is very easy to, yes, very little skill required apart from a good sense of rhythm to, like, you produce a good sound without knowing what to do. Which is also fascinating to see that in some of the research I've done for my book, I found projects where they do drum circles for people with Alzheimer's. And they always give people who have motor control difficulties this type of drum because it's much easier for them to play that than to play a tabla or any of the traditional African drums or that kind of stuff.
A tabla's hard for sure. Now,
Yeah.
I being a scientist, I'm doing a lot about well-being, and I know, as I said, people think it's a bit woo-woo. But what I've asked all my guests is how they feel what they're doing helps our physical and our mental health. So, how do you think drumming affects us? Because I
So
know
I'm
that
gonna
it does.
I'm going to start with, first of all, I'd like to say that when I started writing the science chapter for my book, even though I thought I knew about the science, it blew my mind so much. And it ended up being so big that the publisher said, actually, it's too big a chapter. You're going to have to split it in half because it was a third of the book. So the publisher told me, split it in half with one chapter being about physical health and one chapter being about mental health. And I'm going to start with the mental health because for me, if you're going to just talk about one thing that the drum does, where it's really, really powerful, is that through a phenomenon known as auditory entrainment, the drum changes your brainwave. And it kind of typical rhythm that shamans around the entire human tradition tend to use, which is about 3 to 4 beats per second, it makes your brainwave go into the state, the sort of uh, either low alpha or theta state, which is a state associated with deep meditation. And where it gets very exciting is you do not need to believe in it or do anything special or use headphones or sit quietly or meditate. You can just have that playing in the background and it will change your brain waves. So there's a guy called Jeff Strong, who's an American drummer who's got ADHD, and he's been doing work with autistic people and neurodivergent people since the 1990s. He's both a drummer, a professional drummer who plays music, and he's a clinical scientist. And he has this amazing thing that in the early days in the 1990s, he used to play live for people, and then he did cassette tapes. And now, of course, he has a website called Brainstem Audio, and you can subscribe to that for as little as £9 a month. And you can basically, depending on your state, ask it to play the background tracks that's going to change your consciousness. And because the entrainment works both ways, you can entrain up or down. So yes, mostly I use the track for focus when I'm working. And when I started using the thing, and I'd actually I tried ADHD drugs for a while and didn't ended up agreeing with me, but I got this exact same sensation in my brain that when I was taking ADHD medication, when I listened to his focus tracks. So the other theory I have, so that's entirely mine, but it makes a lot of sense, is that in the Western world, we spend far too much time. There's 5 types of brain waves. It goes from gamma, which is really hyper alert, to alpha, beta, which is normal alert state, to alpha, which is relaxed awareness, to theta, which is deep meditation or light sleep, to delta, which is deep sleep. And in our world, we spend far too much time in the upper part of the brainwaves and not enough time in the relaxed awareness of alpha. In fact, there's in the research I did for the book, I found evidence that people who have PTSD often don't have alpha waves. And there's a guy who spent 10 years trying to get these veterans who had PTSD to have alpha waves, and he tried meditation and he tried biofeedback and he tried lots of stuff, and then somebody said, have you tried drumming? And as he said in the book, in one session half of those people had alpha waves, not 5 sessions, one session, when he'd spent the last 10 years trying to get those people to have alpha waves. And what people keep telling me when they listen to the drum is either that they've never been able to meditate and with the drum it happens, or the one who are skilled meditators keep telling me, wow, I meditate, but like when I listen to your track on top, it's like, it went really deep. And Jeff Strong has live recording on his YouTube channel with people with like an EEG helmet. And then he records their brainwave. And then when he adds the drumming, their brainwave just go poof. The published research shows that even for people who are not skilled, over a period of 10-15 minutes, people's brainwave are trained. So the funny story I like to say is that several years ago, I'd recorded myself to share a track of drumming. And I was playing it on my computer, and my husband, who doesn't believe in all that, went, can you stop that thing? It's making my brain go funny.
It was.
It does this, whether you believe in it or not, So that's one part. The other part that goes more into there's so many layers to it, but we could spend a lot more than what we've got to talk about this, because there's so much juicy research. But the other part is when it's done in a group, it creates people's brain entrance together, and there's a sense of belonging and joy. And you've been to a drum circle, you know that there's something there that transcends people's, whether they're part of the same language even, or whether they're part of the same beliefs or anything like that. It just makes everybody feel there's some sort of sense of it feels like everybody's having fun and doing it together. I would say when people don't quite get it, the only analogy that I often say is that the only experience that people often have had in the Western world of that type of trance-like organized group state is either going to a festival or going to a football match.
Yeah.
And they'll know what I'm talking about. But in normal day-to-day Western world, we don't experience this trance-like state as a normal experience. It's not built into our culture anymore. And yet, what I really deeply believe, and again, I quote evidence from trauma researchers in there, that this kind of rhythm and movement group work is how people would have released trauma in the past. And that it really helps people bypass all the sort of verbal processing, because, as you know, trauma is not usually created when your cortex is shut down. The verbal part of your brain is shut down, so it cannot be accessed through the talking therapy. And so the drumming often, there's tons and tons of stories in some research I've done for the book of people like prison people who have suffered, horrible wars and loss, and people who are addicts, and they all talk about feeling emotions they didn't even know they had, and often when the anger has been expressed, then they can finally access the grief and the sadness that was being protected by the angry feelings. And it's just full of absolutely beautiful stories, there's a story where this guy goes into a center for like very severe heroin addict, that people been addicted for 20 years, and start this drum circle, and this guy says, oh, what the fuck am I having to do this for? They're all dope sick, so they're all angry men, they're not in a good place, and he does this drum circle, and the guy was like, why have I got to do this? He's like, said to the drum circle facilitator, that's the most amazing experience I've ever had in my life. And then gets all the other people to come, and then stays a whole 8 weeks or whatever they do the drum circle on a weekly basis. Yeah.
It,
So
it
there's
yeah, carry on.
so there's tons of research on the mental health side, and then on the physical health side, what's really interesting is there's actual publication that shows that it increases the release of feel good hormones. So when I say it helps the pain of labor, it's not a figure of speech. It is shown to increase the release of endorphins. Decreases pain on the physical level, not just because it changes your state of consciousness. It is shown to increase, to reduce your blood pressure, to sort of, because it's also, when people drum it, there's some element of physicality in it as well. That it's itself a little bit of a workout, but because it's such a joy-inducing activity, it increases all the feel-good hormones in the brain, and then just does all sorts of wonderful health giving things to the body as well as the mind. And of course, the two are linked, because when you flood the brain with feel good hormone, it's going to affect the physiology. And yeah, it's just really mind blowing. When I started reading into it, I thought, I didn't realize that there's published research showing it improves your immune system. Which again makes sense, because makes up in the parallel with the singing. We know that people who sing live longer. We know that people who sing have more feel-good hormones in the body, that it reduces blood pressure, that it increases feelings of well-being, and yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. There's like I said, too much research. You'll have to read the book. In the book, there's all this chapter where I've tried to put everything I could find on the subject.
Brilliant. We will get to the book in a minute, but I do love every activity that releases our feel good, happy hormones. I think they're, as you say, so good for our physical and mental health. And so for me with the drumming, I don't know why, but about just before COVID, I started really being, well, I must have always been drawn to the drums. I do have an African drum. I have a tabla that I've had, as I said, for decades. And then I found some groups I found some groups in London that were doing African drumming. And somehow the shamanic drumming was really attracting me. And then I met you through Cold to Swimming and found out that you were doing drumming circles, and you've done a number of different drumming events. And you've talked about this, and I think they are really, really powerful. I've seen many people really feel, well, very emotional. People often cry and they don't
Yeah.
realize they're going to do that, and then they start crying. So can you tell us what happens at the wonderful drumming circles that you do?
So the first thing I notice happens is when people arrive, they're usually too much in their head, and they're full of their day, and they're busy in their head. And so the drumming helps them come back to the now. For me, that's one of the most powerful thing that the drumming does. And that's not something that is explained in the research, but to feel well, you need to not be stuck in the past, not be stuck in the future. When you're in the now, you're not in an anxious state, you're just present. And so the drumming does that effortlessly for people. And then the other thing that it does is a form of self-expression. So in my drumming circle, I ask people to set an intention for each round of drumming. We do 3. And I encourage them to think about what they need. And when you drum for the purpose of something that you need, it also like help power this, so to speak. It helps in that state of presence. It's like if your brain was all tight and closed up, and suddenly you drum and it opens, and you start to have creativity and ideas and feel, oh yeah, things are not that bad. You relax basically. And then because you do it with other people, there's a sort of entrainment of collective brainwave, but there's also a sense of being carried by everybody else's drumming, which can be incredibly joyful and powerful. And as you've seen, sometimes it's very slow and gentle, and sometimes it's really like, very strong, loud drumming, and people sing and shout. And it's a release. And then by the end of the drum circle, what I've noticed is that because it allows communal expression without words, okay, we share the intention, but the purpose of the drumming for me is that people are drumming together. And I've always noticed that when people come, they don't know each other. There's a few regulars, but it's always newbies, and people come and they feel a bit nervous. They share often when they've not been before. I feel a bit nervous. I'm wondering if I'm going to do this right. And at the end, it feels like you're with a group of friends. Yeah.
Absolutely. And as you say, you don't need to be a drumming expert. So I thought what we do now is we'll just do about a minute where Sophie and I will
Mm-hmm.
just pick up our drums. I hope the sound picks up okay. It should be. So these are our wonderful drums. So most people are going to be just listening to the audio, so they won't see it, but they can have a look at a picture for a shamanic drum. So we'll just do a minute. I'll let you start, Sophie, and I'll join in.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Look at that. Spontaneous. And it does make me feel wonderful. So I love events that I go to. I run a women's group, and I always say at the end, I want people to leave feeling happier and motivated. And I've done that every session that you've done. That's how I've left. I've left feeling absolutely joyful. We're reclaiming joy today, and
Mm.
that I've definitely felt very joyful, very at peace. And I am one of these people that finds it hard to meditate, and I have felt that my brain has relaxed. And a comment I made to you at the last circle that someone I interviewed for my book said, I felt you feel like your tabs have closed, all those tabs we've had open in our
Yes.
crazy brains. I feel like I've turned my brain off and on again. And I keep meaning to look at how I sleep that night. I'm going to try and make an effort to monitor how my sleep's been after one of your sessions, Sophie. But I think I probably sleep very very well. Now you've written this great book, which is on pre-order when this podcast comes out, and I think it's out in September. Is that right?
Yeah.
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 And so
The 12th of September.
12th of September. Wow. So
Yeah.
tell us about the book. I can't wait to read it. Tell us about the book, and you're mainly working at helping women through our different life transitions. So and relating to drumming. So tell us about how the book formed and what it's about.
So initially, the book from the angle of drumming for birth, pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum. And in fact, I really thought that's what I was going to write about. And I very clearly, so discussion, first with my intuition, discussion with a friend who suggested I publish with Womancraft Publishing, and the suggestion of Lucy, who runs Womancraft Publishing, I broadened the topic to be drumming for women through life transitions and lots of different things. But going back to the birth thing alone, so I have drummed at birth, and nobody ever told me to do that. It just felt like I wanted to. It was coming from within, and eventually I got to drum at home birth, and then drum to birth in the hospital. I was actually hired for that purpose as a doula, which made me incredibly happy. And so when I started to decide to write the book, I went back to I discovered when I did some research that has anybody written about drumming and birth? And all I could find was one blog post from like 15 years ago by um, Jane Hardwick Collins in Australia, who's an ex-midwife who founded the School of Shamanic Womancraft. She's written the foreword for the book. So I was incredibly excited to say, wow, nobody's written about this. I really need to write about it. And what I went to do is I went back to the women I'd drummed for, and I'd also been drumming for many years during pregnancy and also during the closing of the bone and postpartum ritual and pregnancy rituals. So I went back to the women whose birth I had drummed at and asked them, what did it do for you? And they all said, in different words, but they all said it gave me my power back. So one of the first woman I drummed for, I didn't pick up my drum until she started pushing the baby out because I felt she needed help at that spot, but not before. And then afterwards, she told me, "Why didn't you do this before? It was so helpful." But I said I didn't do it before because before you didn't need it, you know. And then there was the woman who had hired me specifically to drum at her birth. She said she'd had a quite difficult, traumatizing first birth, and this was a second baby. And she said her consciousness ascended and went to meet her baby's soul, whilst literally riding the sound of the drum. And she said it help her understand that the experience she was going through was not being caused by somebody from the system. So it helped her having a really empowering birth experience at time. And then there was another woman who's, when we moved to the hospital, she told me afterwards, but that I didn't know until I interviewed her. She said when we walked into the hospital, she felt like she'd handed over her power to the hospital. And then I started quietly drumming in the corner in the obstetric unit of the hospital. And she said as soon as I started drumming, all her power came back. And what I found utterly fascinating, Joyce, is there's a paper that's just come out a couple of weeks ago that described women's experience of free birth during the transition stage of labor. And they speak the exact same language. They say, I exited my body and felt like I was in this oneness state. I ascended to get the soul of my baby. And I was like, that's the blueprint that women are meant to have, a very, very powerful rite of passage and an expanded state of consciousness. That's how I experienced both of my births. But the way the modern maternity care system is set up, it actively interrupts. Women are meant to go into a altered state of consciousness during childbirth. And again, there's very little research written about that, although there's now a few big publication by a lady from Israel over the last 3 or 4 years. And I believe that the system actively interrupts that. So drumming is a way to bring that back because you reclaim the altered state of consciousness through the drum. And then I've got lots of other stories which I share in the book from other women who have had other people drumming at their birth who say they took the pain away completely. Like Jen Harvey Collins herself says that I think it was her third birth. She was in that state of transition where she felt she couldn't go on. And then when somebody started drumming live, and she said that she just went into the total state of consciousness and was completely pain-free.
Wow.
And so broadening the topic of the book, what I realize is we live in a culture that from early childhood, us as women teaches us that we don't know what's right for us, that we need to hand over our authority to a expert figure, and the drumming is a way back in, is a way back into, because of the altered state of consciousness, because of the way it brings you back to the now. It's a way to access your own intelligence, your own inner wisdom, your own creativity, and it's literally a way to give the finger to the system, to a system that's really designed to disempower women.
Absolutely. What about supporting women through perimenopause? Can drumming help?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I don't think it's for no reason. I started my discovery of the drum when I was right at the beginning of my perimenopause journey. I was 42. I think I'm 55 now. I think I've crossed that bridge, but I won't know until I haven't bled for a year. Um, I the one thing I found fascinating is the drumming has been appeared in my life at the beginning of my perimenopause and kept growing into power during that time. And because it's a bit like, for me, perimenopause is such a deep transformation. And again, it's portrayed very negatively in our society. So is puberty, so is menarche, so is motherhood, the Jen Hardwick Collins says the things that are systematically ridiculed and downplayed and presented as negative in our culture in women's transition, they're always a sign that they hold great power. And because women are often not held by a community of elders who help them understand the power of what's going on, but also the make sense of the experience, drumming is a way, especially in the context of doing it with other women, is a way to access a state of calm, peace, and closing the tabs, as you say, where you can make sense of what's going on. And it's especially powerful if it's done in a circle with other women who are at the same stage of life or a little bit ahead in the journey. So my personal experiences over the last 5 years, I've been drumming with two other women once a week at dawn in the local woodland, and it's the most supportive practice I have, because we do the drumming and then we talk about what's going on in our lives. And because it's like the drumming has washed off all the dross first, so the quality of the conversation we have, they're very deep. And because we've not done it for so long and we know each other so well, for me it's like my spiritual practice. It's like going to church, what I'm doing, going drumming with those two women in the woods. And it's been an anchor. That's what's really interesting is I've gone and asked the other two women to write something about how it feels like for them in the book, and they both say the same thing. It's an anchor. So I would say drumming is great if you're in perimenopause or menopause journey, and please, even better if you can do it in conjunction with other women. And I'm not the only one who says that. There's lots of other stories in the book of women talking about how the drum appeared and led them to led them forward in the process of perimenopause and menopause.
I firmly
And you
believe.
look it, yeah,
Sorry, Carol.
leads you to other women, and
Yeah.
it's like it builds a community, which I think again is a really important part. You were not meant to be doing this alone.
I really feel quite fanatically, shall I say, that more than any other time, I think at perimenopause, women, if they can find their tribe and find other women and find lots of different tribes. I've got lots of different tribes. I've got my dancing
Mm.
tribes, my raving tribes, my drumming tribes, my work tribes, all different. But I think it's such a healing and joyful way to spend our time. I think women being with women later in life is more important than it. Maybe all our life, but especially for me at that time. And I know that you had a late ADHD diagnosis. Again, that
Yeah.
perimenopause for lots of women, it's a very common story, bringing up that realization of being neurodivergent. And I know that for you, that you have used your drug. As you said, you've tried medication, but now
Hmm.
you've been talking about this great way of dealing with this. And I've been to your brilliant online workshop about microdosing drumming. So people know about microdosing mushrooms, but you talk
Yeah.
about microdosing drumming, and that's really helped you with your ADHD. So tell us more about that.
So the, I first microdosed psilocybin mushroom for a couple of years when I was struggling with my mental health. And then that came to a natural end when I felt it done what I needed to do. And then once I was halfway through writing the book, I don't know how it came to be, but I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to start a practice to drum 5 minutes a day, commit to drum 5 minutes a day. And then I thought I'm going to do it like I did the mushrooms, with journaling and setting an intention for a cycle of like a few weeks. And what fascinated me is that within 2 weeks, I had the exact same experience I had with the mushrooms. That is, when I started taking microdose of psilocybin mushrooms, within 2 weeks, suddenly I heard a very judgmental voice in my head that I didn't know was there before. So one day I would sort of notice this voice going, "You should be doing this, you haven't done that." And I was like, almost like talking to it, going, "Well, it's not helpful. I stopped doing that. Nobody's died." And then when I started doing the drumming, the microdose of the drumming, so that's 5 minutes of drumming a day with intention. And within 2 weeks, I had the exact same experience on something different, where I noticed a pattern in my brain that I had not been previously aware of, which was a very negative pattern of basically I felt unappreciated by a family member. And I remember sitting at breakfast and ruminating, "Oh, it's not said thank you, blah, blah, blah." And then I heard this voice in my head that said, "Well, the real reality of what's happening here is you're not appreciating yourself." And the truth of that was so clear that it stops all the ruminating. I heard that voice, that heard that statement. And then um, my husband, who was the one I felt unappreciated by, walked into the kitchen at that very moment and went, "I wanted to thank you so much for all the things you organized for my birthday yesterday." And it was so mind blowing, the parallel between the two, that I a few months later, so I started incorporating a chapter about this in the book where I compare psychedelics and drumming. And I started talking about this practice. And when I went to a conference, a women drumming conference in November last year, and I gave a talk about how drumming helps women through life transition and how drumming helps mental health. And I shared this practice, and that was amazing again that I had a stall at this conference, and I've lost count of how many women came to me and said, I have a drum and I've never thought, like they were mostly using the drum for other people in a healing capacity, but they had not thought about using it for themselves. And they said, I'm going to do your thing. I'm going to do that thing that you're talking about. And so then in March this year, I ran a month-long drum microdosing circle online, and I asked all these women. It was a small group; there was like 6 of us, but I asked them to score themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 about what they wanted to work on over the course of the 6 weeks. And it was all the things about being more present, feeling more peace in my heart, mental health stuff. And I thought, I'd be happy if they had like a rise from 1 point on the 1 to 10 scale, but they had rise from went from like 3 to 4 to 7, 8 points in the space of 4 weeks. They had a 50 to 70% improvement in the intention that they'd actually set for themselves. I was completely mind blown. I never expected that to happen. And this is, I know, a very small group, but still, I was like, wow, this is something really, really powerful, especially in a system where so many women are struggling with mental health, and so much of what's being offered is very narrow in its focus, and not often doesn't quite work with the reality of what's happening for women. So the quote I always like to give that talks about how Western world approach mental health and how traditional healing would have been done in human societies, still is in many places in the world, is when the genocide happened in Rwanda, in the years that followed, the Western world sent Western talking therapists to people in Rwanda to help them with their trauma. And there's this quote from this guy that I was able to hunt and put in my book, where he says, there was no drumming, singing, and dancing and going out in the sunshine to bring the joy back in your heart. There was no knowing that the community had set the day aside to support you. Instead, they took us individually into dingy little room and made us talk about bad things that happened to us. We had to ask them to leave. And that's, for me, that's really the crux of it. Yes, sometimes talking therapy can be useful, but we don't exist in a vacuum. And we don't exist without a society that is not really designed for supporting joy. And those practices, the rhythmical trance-like state as a community with support, they're very, very powerful. And when you look at historical stuff, and then my book is full of quotes from other scientists and trauma researchers that say traditionally human trauma release has always involved mental health support, has always involved ceremony and dance and drumming and movement and stuff that allows to move the energy that's stuck into the body, instead of talking at the head like if your brain is just a meat puppet.
Absolutely. Let's
Drumming,
talk.
because drumming does the vibration as well, so it treats the whole body, as you've experienced when you do sound bath. It does something. I've not been able to find much research on that, unfortunately, but for me, there's clearly something about the vibration that is very healing and powerful too.
I totally agree. I totally agree. And you talked about ceremony, and
Yeah,
for May, I came along to the beautiful Beltane in the area where we do our drumming circles as well, and just spending the whole day in nature in a beautiful place with beautiful people, and we did some dancing and we did a lot of drumming, and we spent hours discussing the divine feminine. And I thought, are we really going to stay here for, was it 4 hours to talk about divine feminine?
four
And
hours. Yeah.
you led it brilliantly. So can you tell us a little bit about the sort of ceremonies that are linked to all of this as well, with the dancing and
The
drumming
wheel of
and
the you mean the wheel of the year? You know, the
yeah.
thing is, ceremonies woven in my entire rituals and ceremonies woven in my entire work, because I feel that as a culture, Western culture has lost rites of passages, and that really helps people make sense. So I've started bringing ceremonies to pregnant women as opposed to baby showers, mother blessing type ceremonies. And I started bringing ceremonial element to the closing the bone rituals, and there was already a ritual, but I brought more stuff. And so the Wheel of the Year ceremony for me, where it's been really beautiful, is about 5 years ago. I attended my first ever Wheel of the Year ceremony. I remember feeling again, same as the drumming, this sense of, oh, wow, where has this been all my life? I was brought up as a Catholic, and I found church to be tedious and boring as a child. I remember thinking, oh, God, got to go to Mass, and rejected this religion in my teens, because it felt just like the God that was portrayed in the Catholic religion felt like some unhappy father figure, Victorian father figure that was looking at me from above and kind of waving his finger. Just keep wondering where that voice comes from, like you're being told. The priest would say, you need to pray every day, and I wasn't. So I imagined there was this bearded guy in the sky that was going, you're not praying. So those Wheel of the Year ceremony, they're joyful, but they're also deeply connected with the rhythm of nature. So there's, in the Celtic Wheel of the Year ceremony, there are the two solstices and the two equinoxes, and then basically there's 8 festivals in total. Every 6 weeks there's something. And what it helps you see is the ever-changing rhythm of life. So for me, it really helped me appreciate the changing season. I used to really dislike winter, and now I don't, because I can see the embodied wisdom of winter, which is a time of going inward, the time of resting. But also because every 6 weeks I'm part of a group of people who co-create those ceremonies. Then it basically doesn't go a month before I'm embedded again in like co-creating the next one. We often will start working on it 2 or 3 weeks before the ceremony. And so then we sit in circle, and we call it a dreaming, because it's the opposite of a corporate meeting where everybody's vying for like my voice stronger than yours, my opinion, I'm the best. Okay. This is a co-creation where we sit and first share about how this time of the year feels for us, what's being brought up, and then we weave that into how we're going to present the ceremony, because it's different every time. And of course, in each ceremony, there is its own very flavor. Beltane, that you'll be talking about, is a time of peak fertility. So that's why you have somebody chosen to represent the divine feminine and somebody to represent the divine masculine for the whole year. So a May queen and a May king. And then, see, we've just as some last Saturday was summer solstice celebration. So that's the longest day of the year. So of course there's an energy to that, which interestingly is somewhat an energy of pause, because during the solstices, the sun stands still for a few days. And in tradition, when people were actively farming the land, when everybody was doing that, the solstice would be a time of rest, because nature, as like the birds are fledged, and there would be a pause between the time where the harvest is needed, where there's a time of like celebration of the bounty of nature. So this is like this kind of celebration of this longest day, the sun at its strongest, and a time of reflection and pause as well. And for me, I really encourage people, if they feel that way inclined, to find people who celebrate the Wheel of the Year, because then having this moment where you can reflect on, oh yes, that's what the energy is doing right now, and living more in tune with that, instead of trying to always be what our society encourages us to do, which for me brings me back to my PhD and chronobiology, which is we're not meant to be working at the same peak level of energy all the time. Our energy is meant to be doing basically working with the natural energy of nature. And you can't do that from an intellectual point of view. It needs to be done by an actual reclamation of being in connection with nature.
And with nature, you and I both love swimming. We love our
Mm.
wild swimming. Tell us, why do you love swimming? Wild swimming.
So I think I need to tell about how I came towards swimming, which was noticing that I was feeling overwhelmed all the time because I was stuck in this unconscious idea that I had to be productive all the time, even though I was self employed. And I made this conscious decision to start reconnecting with nature, which started with nature walk in the nature reserve where I now drum and walk my dog every day. But also that, yeah, I thought, oh, I want to start finding a really nice place to wild swim in Cambridge. And so then I discovered this beautiful club that I go to in Cambridge that's got like a beautiful place in nature. And I started in the summer. And what was really interesting is I noticed how much of an impact it had on my well-being and mental health. I used to think that swimming, which was something I typically did in the sea on holiday, on holiday, usually quite relaxed. So the well-being goes hand in hand with that. But I'd not been in a situation where the summer I started in 2018. It was very, very hot. So I took my kids from school and would like go to the river after school every day with them. And I just noticed how good it made me feel. And then when the weather started to turn towards the autumn, I remember feeling really disappointed that I was going to have to stop this. And I met some people who were swimming all year round, and then started to think, okay, I'm going to see how far I can go. And then I've not stopped since. It was 7 years ago. I have swum all year round since for the last 7 years in the same spot in the river. And there's several things I feel it does. One is it's a deep immersion in nature. So again, this reconnection with the natural rhythms of the season. It's an embodied one. The second one is I really feel that it's a whole body grounding. When I'm swimming in a river, I feel like I'm washing all my shit off, switching off the tabs, whatever you want to call it. Well, especially when it's really cold. You can't go in the point half degree water and think about something else. But when it's warm, I find it's lovely to be in nature, close to wildlife, close to the plants, and then the third aspect is it's a community of people that I've come to really love, because the kind of people who like all year round one swimming, they're not about show and they're not about pretending. They're real, genuine people. And I've never really enjoyed small talk, and I find that the type of people who are attracted towards swimming, they tend to be women like us. They tend to be people who are interested in showing the real themselves. I've always been what you see is what you get people, and I find this kind of community. And there's a lot of laughter and raucousness that goes with it, and especially in the winter, a sense of doing something really quite adventurous and extraordinary. And I remember 2 years ago when the entire river froze over the winter. There was a group of women went swimming, and we couldn't swim because the entire river was frozen. But we bashed the ice with a big stick and then took turn dunking ourselves. And then some women had brought a big cake that she'd baked, and we sat there drinking coffee and eating our cakes after the swim, the dip, and it felt just absolutely such fun. I've got a picture of myself like in the ice with a hoodie hat on and looking, grinning like a loon.
It really brings us a lot of joy, and we're playing. We're I think that sense of play is really, really important. And we also have a lovely Robin that I know has come
Yeah,
to see you when you've been swimming. This Robin, it's a very wise Robin. Robin it always comes and talks to
yeah.
us. And Sophie, so I've called this podcast "Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This?" So for you with your drumming, are there what are the main things people have learned from the drumming that they didn't realize before? Are there things that they've thought, wow, I didn't know that?
I don't think people realize until they do it, the power that it carries. I don't think people can understand it by reading about it. I know I've written a book about it, but my goal is to use the science to make people overcome their skepticism and then give them an actual experience, because people are surprised. I get, as I said, a lot of people in my drum circle. The last one you came to was there's a lot of people who've never done this before, and every single one of them, I've never seen people who weren't amazed. They're like, and it's really difficult to describe with words because it's an experience that our culture doesn't really have words for, but actually it's an experience of altered state of consciousness in a group with other people where you feel a sense of belonging and a sense of being at home with yourself and the same sense being at home with other people. So that's really powerful.
Here. It really is. Right, the final question, Sophie. So I'm very interested to hear what you say. What makes you happy and where is your happy place?
So it's really interesting, Joyce, because recently I realized that every single one of my hobbies involve rhythm and movement.
Mhm.
So I do the drumming, I do the wild swimming, and I do the five rhythm dancing. And for me, it's always better if it's out in nature. With possibly the exception of the five rhythm dancing, because I found that when it's in nature, the sound doesn't reverberate quite the same. It's something about dancing indoors that was quite good. But generally speaking, rhythm and movement in nature, which is why the swimming hits so many spots and the drumming in the woods hits so many spots. I just find that. And being around like minded folks who share the same, eternal seekers of growth and like people who are, I've noticed that since I became aware that I'm neurodivergent, that actually all my friends are. So that's one of the things I
Yep.
often want to say to people who are saying, yeah, people who are neurodivergent tend to hang out together like a pack of poorly regulated wolves. So if all your friends have ADHD, I've got news for you. But it's what I love about the community of people, whether it's the swimming, the drumming, or the dancing, and they all blend into each other a little bit, is that there's a sense of being with people who are genuine and people who don't run away from you when you're feeling low. Quite the opposite. Whereas some communities tend to have the spiritual love and light only label, and then underneath is basically when you're in shit, nobody wants to do anything with you. Here it feels like really connected. I have no experience of the five rhythm outside of Cambridge, but I've heard lots and lots and lots of people saying, "Oh my God, what you've got here is amazing." Because Cambridge has an unusual setup where the local dance community hosts 6 or 7 different teachers in rotation. And so we get to experience lots of different styles. Whereas if you go dancing, say in London, you're likely to go to the same teacher week on, week on. But people also say that the community is exceptionally welcoming and friendly. And I've had that when we do the Wheel of the Year ceremony, where people have come for the first time and they've said, I've never been in a community like this one. And so my happy place is to be around people who enjoy the same kind of weird shit that I do, like the drum.
The same
Like,
woo woo.
singing. Yeah, drumming like last Saturday when we did the solstice ceremony, we did a water ceremony. So we went in the stream, which is like only ankle deep, and we did like a honoring the water. We drum, we sang, poured some sacred water in the stream, and then there's a bit between the two shallow bits. There's a dip where you can immerse yourself up to the neck. So we all went in there as well, and
Wow.
that's so raucous and joyful and playful. And it was 32 degrees last Saturday, and the water was warm, so it was really perfect for that kind of stuff. And then we went back into having a sort of more ceremonial part of the day. But they started with a drum journey, and then we did make flower crown. You'd be up for that, you like that drawing yourself, and there's something about the playfulness that's the thing I've also found in the swimming, in the drumming, and in the dancing. The first time I went dancing 6 years ago, I had my mind blown because the only experience of dance I'd had before was clubbing. And in clubbing, there's often a judgment, a performative element. When I was a teenager, that's what it was like. And the idea, are you good enough at dancing? And I went dancing there, and in the community I'm in now, I've had friends who have said, "Come, is so much fun," and people are like, "I'm feel too self-conscious," and I said, "No, you don't understand. Nobody gives a fuck what you look like. This is not this kind of place." There's people in their 20s and there's people in their 70s in that dance community, and then just a group of people who love to dance and want to get together and share that space. Yeah.
I, I wanted to come to the ceremony you did on Saturday, but I was literally just down the road at a
I
wonderful
know, I
festival.
saw.
Yeah, the Wildwood Festival. Literally, we weren't very far apart. If we banged loud enough, we probably could have heard each other. But yeah, which is always at the summer solstice. So I think I'll always miss that. But yeah, yeah, Sophie. Honestly, it's been so wonderful to speak to you. I'm so glad that I've met you now, and been able to come to your drum circles and the other things that you do, and it's been a real privilege. The very last question, which is a little bit hard. So, what advice would you have given your younger self?
I would go to, if I could go back to my younger self, I would say to her what I now say to women, which is do it your way. Trust that your own unique way is the right way for you. Don't compare yourself to other people. Don't think that the right way is the way that person is doing it. Just follow your unique way of doing things. And I think that's always been a big part of the way I am anyway, because my parents tell me stories of even when I was a child. I was always kind of quite opinionated, and I remember most of my life having a feeling like I'm going that way. And when people would say, you can't do that because you're not like science, I was discouraged to follow that by being told you're not good enough at math. And I was like, well, watch me. And that didn't stop me from doing science. But I think embracing a unique gift and not thinking I wish I was more like that, because when you do that you stop yourself from saying what makes you you and what makes you unique and beautiful, in comparing to the dance or into the drumming or I read in a song I heard the sentence, nobody dance like you do, and I thought that's quite beautiful.
That is. And Sophie, it's been absolutely fantastic. And I've realised we have more things in common because I'm also rubbish at math. I should probably never be the scientist. And also I was brought up a Catholic, and I also realised that the stories I was hearing made no sense. And this God figure made no sense, and the Jesus figure made no sense. So
and the idea that you're born a sinner, you're born bad, how is that supposed to be empowering? It's like, yeah, every time I get myself at a wedding in a church or anything to do with that, I think it's just still the same. It's not grown, it's not evolved, it's still a very constricted. Whereas, like what one of the things I challenged the priest with when I was in my teen was like, where's the joy? Like, give me African gospel choirs, right? African American gospel choirs. Where's the joy? And the priest, he said, the joy is inside. I was like, not buying it.
That is a brilliant place to finish. So, Sophie, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Joyce. It's been a real pleasure for me too.
I hope we have got some people now who are just going to go try and beat their own drum.
Yeah. And join, the one thing I just going to want to say that as a parting thing. Last year, I ran a series of conversations with women who were overwhelmed. And the one thing I said to them was, what did you used to enjoy doing as a child?
Yeah.
And what they said was always things about being in nature, always things about making art, always things about music, things about what we're talking about now, that reclaiming that, especially when women are going through later part of the perimenopause and big changes in their life, reclaiming ways to make joy, which is, all about your series of interviews at the moment. This is where it's at.
Perfect. Thank you so much for all your wise words.
Thank you, Joyce.
And I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.